fights, antisocial, attitudinal acceptability towards gang affiliation, and substance abuse. So this is what we wanted to measure within the study. The predictive variable, called in some studies the independent variable, is rites of passage instructions. I wanted to look at how rites of passage instructions influence or correlated between the outcome variables of suspensions and fights. Do children taking rites of passage have any differences in their behavior when it comes to suspensions, fights? Affiliation and susceptibility of gangs, meaning that what are their attitudes towards it? I didn't ask them directly, did they use cigarettes, alcohol, and marijuana? Those are the substance abuses. I didn't look at hard substances. I looked at cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco. But I wanted to know what their friends thought about it. In other words, who did they choose to associate themselves with based on the number of years that they increased in rites of passage, and also maturation by age and grade as well. Do young people choose better friends based on having more increased years of rites of passage? With any study with students and with human studies, it's always hidden variables. You will never cover all of the hidden variables, but some hidden variables stand out that you really can't ignore. For instance, if there's a strong gender representation in the study, then you may want to consider gender. You want to measure it, which I did, as well as grade and age. We're talking about high school students. The students range from 9 to 12, so I couldn't ignore grade and age. A 9th grader may respond differently to a question than a 12th grader. A 9th grader who is 14, 13, 14, 15 years old, 9th or 10th grader would respond differently to, may respond differently to certain questions about substance abuse or certain questions about friends or fights. If the oldest students, the students range from 9th grade to 12th, the oldest, I had some 18 and 19 year olds in the study. So I wanted to measure not only the predictive variable to the outcome variables of suspensions, fights, gangs, and substance abuse, but also what would have been potentially hidden variables of gender, grade, and age. Next. The null hypothesis is what your study should prove that the null hypothesis is not true, more so than proving that the alternative hypothesis is true. That's the academic approach with research. The null hypothesis essentially states that RPIs are not statistically correlated to increasing prosocial behavior. So if the null hypothesis is true, it would mean that there's no correlation between RPIs and increasing prosocial behavior. Also, the null hypothesis states that RPIs are not statistically correlated to decreasing antisocial behavior. Notice the difference with increasing prosocial behavior and decreasing antisocial behavior. Both of those essentially the same effect. I didn't know the outcome. I had to first dig into the data from the study and determine what was stated. But if the null hypothesis is true, it would mean that RPIs did not make a difference in increasing prosocial behavior, nor did RPIs make a difference in decreasing antisocial behavior. That there is no statistical correlation to the predictive variable of RPIs and the outcomes. If the null hypothesis is true, rites of passage does not make a difference with young people. This is just a short statement here. In the interest of time, I'll go on. Next slide. The alternative hypothesis states that RPIs are statistically correlated to either increasing prosocial behavior or decreasing antisocial behavior. The alternative hypothesis is that RPIs do in fact make a difference. That there is a statistical correlation to the predictive variable and the outcome variables. So I looked at the increasing years. Increasing years of RPIs, if the alternative hypothesis is true, increasing years of RPIs have a positive correlation with prosocial behaviors and or a negative inverse correlation with antisocial behaviors, meaning that as the years of RPIs increase, as students take 1 year, 2 year, 3 or 4 years of RPIs, that it's an inverse relationship with antisocial behaviors, that antisocial behaviors decrease. That's considered an inverse relationship. The RPQ, this is the Rites of Passage questionnaire. This is the instrument that I used. It was 11 questions. An 11-question, 5-point Likert scale item, meaning that it went from students that disagreed the most with a question and who agreed the most with the question. So it was range, with the middle question being neutral. Questions 1 and 2 were about fights and suspensions, respectively. 3 and 5 were about gangs. Questions 6 and 7 were about cigarettes, not the students' use, but the use among their friends, the use among who they chose to associate with, based on if the years of rites of passage had any correlation with them making better choices of friends. And again, not only cigarettes, but questions 8 and 9 were about alcohol, and the last 2 questions, 10 and 11, about marijuana. The RPQ is found in Appendix A of the dissertation. The design and methodology of the study is a quantitative study, meaning that it's data-driven, it's not qualitative and narrative-driven. It's a quasi-experimental and non-random study, meaning that it wasn't random selection, it was non-random, qualitative with a treatment and control group, as well as a pilot study that preceded. It's convenient sampling because I was aware of the schools, aware that they taught rites of passage. Multivariate analysis, which I had previously explained with that predictor and the outcome variables. So I looked at several different variables as well as the hidden variables. The study used a Delphi method, and one of the experts that were on the Delphi method is Dr. Kelly. She's in the audience. I wanted to have experts in the field review the RPQ to give me some ideas on how to tweak it. Is it weak in certain areas? Should I revise certain areas? So based on that input, some fine-tuning to the RPQ was made. And so I had this dialogue independently with the 3 experts of the Delphi method. And a pilot study was implemented. I'll explain the pilot study as we move on. Treatment group. The treatment group were the students who had already had exposure to rites of passage instruction. But then there was a control group of students who did not have exposure to the treatment variable. They did not have rites of passage. So what were the differences between those 2 groups? Data analysis was completed through Excel and statistical package for social science studies, and the RPQ is psychometric, which meaning that basically it measured what students thought. It measured what they thought about certain topics. Next. So the sample was a charter school, in 2 charter schools in the city of Philadelphia. The names, the Wangari Maathai Charter School and the Grace Mitchell Charter School, those are pseudonyms. I wanted to provide anonymity and confidentiality to the students, so those are not the names. Students were low-income, urban, predominantly African-American students. Both schools were Title I schools. There was 115 students total in the study. In the pilot study, 33 students, 82 students in the control and treatment groups. Split, it was 31 in the control, 51 in the treatment groups. The power analysis was conducted for the sample size, which determined that it met critical effect size, which means basically that the population of students were related to the general population of students in the school and in the environment. That was it in fact did have critical effect size. That was determined before the study proceeded. Next. So some selections from the literature. It's chapter 2. I went into detail on various previous studies directly related, indirectly related to my study. And sure enough, I found that Dr. Angela Campbell, who is in the audience as well, had conducted a study on rites of passage at one of the locations. Her study is Gendered Passageways in the Freedom School, an ethnographic study of adolescent girls. And some of the findings were similar to some of the findings that I had. Liquid Soldiers, Fluidity, and Gang Members is a study about how young people that are involved in gangs, they kind of come and go in gangs. You have young people who are associated with gangs but not necessarily gang members. And then it looked at the differences with some males and females with regards to gang memberships. For instance, males tend to engage in gang membership over a longer period of time, whereas females, if they don't, at a certain period of time, it's a drop-off and decline. So it looked at some issues around gang membership and the fluidity, what they call liquid soldiers, because young people come and go, but the exposure is the concern. Dating trajectories for middle to high school students found that if students are involved in dating younger in life, that they have trajectories for more antisocial behavior later in life. I found that to be an interesting study. Celebrating debutantes and quinceañeras, coming of age in American ethnic communities. This is a study on the rites of passage ceremonies of the debutantes and the quinceañeras. I was very interested in the fact that other cultures had rites of passage ceremonies. I looked at rites and religions as well, but the studies gave more validity to mine because it's no instruction associated with those ceremonies. That as a young or as little instruction, some of it is strong religious-based instructions. For instance, with the communion, baptism, the sacraments, the rites of passages in Hindu and Buddhist cultures, Hajj in Islam and Shahada. All religions have forms of rites of passage, but according to Pew Research study, younger people are less involved in religions. So while religions play a part in improving pro-social behavior, there are fewer students that are affiliated over time with religions. So all of the studies basically gave more background and backbone to why my study was needed. So this was the purpose of the literature review. Next slide. Summary of the pilot study. Now we move to the data. Excuse me. Again, this was a qualitative study, so the data said a lot. Within the pilot study, I found a low positive correlation of 0.25 for overall with rites of passage. With grade and age, please note, because this is going to be important in explaining the rest of the study, that it was a decline in the correlation. It was a weak 0.09 overall correlation by grade, and slightly even weaker by age. So what does this mean? This is a dematuration pattern, but would this hold throughout the study was very important. But again, notice it's a higher correlation with increasing years of RPI, 0.25, and it's a steep fall off for the correlation with increasing years in antisocial behavior by grade, and even less by age. I found a strong positive correlation of 0.68 pro-social attitude toward marijuana, meaning that as students increased in years of rites of passage, they made better choices among friends who used marijuana. And this is just one of the strongest correlations that was found with the pilot study. The conclusion was that the pilot study had validity and reliability, and I was able to now move on to the treatment and control groups. The Delphi method had been conducted, critical effect size was determined, and the data was retrievable, understandable, and explainable. It made sense. Regardless of the outcome, I would still have to proceed. So if I found that rights was not correlated, meaning that the null hypothesis was true, of course I would still proceed, but I was, of course, happy to find that we had something that makes a difference in the lives of young people. Next. I looked at hidden variables very quickly. Male pro-social mean was found of 3.8 with a correlation of 0.18 for acceptability with having friends in gangs and neighborhoods. So one of the things that stood out in the data with the gender analysis was about gangs. The males tended to be more around gangs than females. The female prosocial mean was 4.57 with a correlation of 0.25 for acceptability with having friends in gangs. So notice that for males it was 0.18, for females 0.25. So females indicated from the data made better choices among friends than males with regards to gangs. But I found very little difference in the overall mean score. It was only a 0.1 difference. The overall mean score for males was 4.0, and the overall mean scores for females was 4.1. And it wasn't a lot of difference. Both I found positive correlations overall for males and females, 0.27, 0.18. But what this meant is that I didn't have to worry about gender being a strong hidden influence in the data. That was extremely important. So with gender being isolated, I moved on to the next part of the study. And here we come to findings on the predictive variable. This is core part of the study, the next two slides. The predictive variable and hidden variables by grade and age with the groups separated. And what I found is that with the groups separated, it was, and I'll explain this, it was a low overall score, 0.03. So I had to ask myself, maybe Rites is no strong correlation. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I had to dig into the data. But I also found the treatment group who had rites of passage, by grade, it's a low correlation as well, 0.09. By age, it's still a low correlation, 0.08. This is with the groups separated. These are the 3 points from the treatment group. So maybe it didn't make a difference. But then I found some strong negatives for grade and age, which again explained that dematuration pattern. What I found is that as students increase in grade, they have a stronger tendency to away from prosocial behavior. As they increased in grade, I found a correlation of negative 0.32. That's a moderate correlation, and that is significant. That if we let young people to increase by grade with no intervention, not only RPIs, no other type of intervention, that they may become more antisocial by grade. And it was a little stronger by age. That as students increase in years by age, they may become, it's a correlation of negative 0.36 of them possibly becoming more antisocial, less prosocial, according to the data. This is what was indicated. So I had to define this as a dematuration pattern in the study. And I couldn't stop there with the data, because I had to figure out, why do I have a low correlation for RPIs if I have such high negative correlations in increasing years by grade and age? This was separated. So what I did, I combined the treatment and the control groups to add more data variation to the study. I'll explain that. So the students in the control group made up 37.8% of the overall study outside of the pilot, between the treatment and the control group. The control group students made 37.8%. So by adding them, I added a wider range of variation. I wasn't just looking at the students that were probably good students anyway. So it was a low statistical correlation, because I'm just looking at the students basically that are quote unquote doing well, or what we might define as doing well. I added those students with the students who did not have rites of passage from the control group. And there's where I struck gold. I found an overall correlation of 0.21. Now, in scientific studies about germ cells and things like that, that would be a low correlation, but we're dealing with human subjects. It comes down to a child making just one right or wrong decision, which makes, with human studies and young people, a 0.21 overall correlation important and significant. It's that one decision, one mistake that a child could make. And RPIs influences prosocial behavior according to the data found when I combined the treatment and control group, when I added the 37.8% students from the control group. And the dematuration pattern held. That was the other thing. So I found a higher correlation for improving pro-social scores among students, and I found the dematuration pattern to hold. Increasing years by grade overall resulted in a negative 0.1. That if we allow young people to just go from freshman year to high school, that they may become more antisocial in the decisions that they make. And if we allow them to increase only by age, I found some 9th graders with more pro-social scores than 19-year-olds, but those 9th graders had 4, 5, 6 years of rites of passage instruction because they had received it in their middle school schools. Whereas some 12th graders that had transferred in, that did not have previous years of rites of passage, had far more antisocial scores than not only the other 12th graders, but the 9th graders who had more increasing years of RPI. So by age, I found an inverse of negative 0.13, where students score a lot lower. In mean scores, I looked at the lower and upper bounds of the scores, and consistently throughout, RPIs were found to influence pro-social behavior. Thanks. So we come down to the last 2 slides. The implications of the study. First and foremost, the researcher, I got used to talking to myself in terms of the researcher, the writer. I recommend that rites of passage, RPIs, be considered as a core subject, along with math, science, reading, and arithmetic. If it makes this much of a difference, the students in the study receive rites of passage once a week as well. So I also recommended daily implementation, but if we're dealing with a variable that makes this significant of a difference in the lives of young people, and it could be attached to behavioral outcomes, which is not on this slide, but is in the dissertation. If it could be not behavioral outcomes, instructional outcomes. For instance, if rites of passage is a part of social studies, language arts, if it's a separate class in itself, if you have learning outcomes associated with it, if students are doing writing assignments, reading, they're giving presentations and projects, and learning outcomes can be associated with it, and it makes this type of difference, I think we should consider it as a core subject, which is part of my implications for the practice. Daily implementation in various schools, charters, public, private, religious schools, wherever we have young people. Especially if those students have high exposure to antisocial behavior, which I argue the social services, detention centers, youth, and adults should consider rites of passage. And this should be for a broad and diverse population of students of all age, grade, race, income, religion, regardless. Young people have coming of age challenges, and the more, the better. And even those that do not, even those who are better behaved, it comes down to that one decision that they may make. If they had the substantive learning experiences for years about positive behavior, about coming of age, about identity and choices, when it comes down to that 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old adult making that one decision, they may make the right decision based off of having those lessons. And the cost-benefit ratio, the cost is low and the benefits are tremendous. The cost-benefit ratio is so tremendous for schools because schools would have to do very little for their budget. They just need to reassign teachers. Teachers who have some background and experience. Social studies teachers would find an easy transition into rites of passage. So it would not be a tremendous cost to schools, but the benefit is tremendous for students and society. Last slide. So for future research, I recommended replication and expansion of the study. These are my findings, but let's conduct some other studies. Let's compare the data. Let's see what other studies yield. So it should be future research, future studies on classes and programs, ones that exist already or ones that are implemented. I did not look at GPAs, although the behaviors I looked at influenced GPAs, influenced instructional success. There were other studies that looked at rites of passage and rites of passage related classes and programs, and they found that rites, in fact, have a positive outcome on GPAs and academic success. It would benefit and it would be relevant and of interest to find out the influence of RPIs and related delivery on graduation rates, dropout rates, reducing indicators of criminality and future imprisonment, teen pregnancy, and other societal concerns that may develop in the coming of age years of youth. That is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikasa. At this time, I'm going to open up questions and comments from our board members, our committee members in attendance, Dr. Bello and Dr. Kiris. So at this time, any questions or comments in regard to the PowerPoint presentation that Mikasa presented?
Dr. Kiris, would you like to start?
Thank you, sure. Mikasa, I just want to commend you for the work that you've done to get to this point. It's obvious that you put a tremendous amount of effort into this and that you were extremely thoughtful, not only in selection of your topic and selecting something that was really mission-driven and important to you, but also really being very thoughtful about the methodology that you used to ensure that you were going to come out with a result that was meaningful and statistically significant. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
I'm curious about, you mentioned, okay, you get to this point where you get these results and you look at your treatment groups and you see a low correlation. Can you just tell me a little bit, how did you get to the point where you decided to sort of go back and retool and combine these groups and do another level of analysis?
Sure. The pilot study with 33 students, it did not distinguish between students who had rites of passage in previous years and students who did not. So the correlation I found, 0.25, was a pretty, strong correlation. But when I separated the groups into the treatment and control groups, this is two different schools. When I separated them, I found that the treatment group had a low correlation. And the control group had strong, moderate, negative correlations with decreasing antisocial behavior. So when I first looked at it, I was a little disappointed. I didn't know why, but I had to kind of sift over the data, look at some columns. This was in Excel before it went to SPSS. And I really decided that the study was incomplete, that I needed to also combine the treatment and control group, even if I got the same data, but to combine it and to see what the data would tell me. And sure enough, when I combined it, I found a correlation 0.21 that was similar, not far off from what I found in the pilot study, which told me the influence of the predictive variable on the data.
Well, kudos to you. Again, it's really difficult within this type of program and this type of timeline to even consider doing anything that approximates an experimental study. What would you, if someone were going to replicate your study, what advice would you give them about timeline or about analysis?
I would tell them to have a whole lot of time available first, and to not to let the data speak for itself, and to look at instructional outcomes more so than what I did, to look at the GPAs, maybe students that are held back, graduation rates, and some other outcomes as well. I looked at, my study was about behavior more so than instructional outcomes, but I think that the instructional outcomes would be very valuable to schools.
Absolutely. And I promise this is my last question. So in a perfect world, if you had more time and you were going to do sort of a longer term kind of longitudinal study, in a perfect world, you'd be able to compare students who had no rites of passage instruction at all over a longer period of time.
True, yes.
With those who had a systematic approach to that over the course of their educational career.
Yes, I would consider 2 schools. One with rights, one without, and more students, maybe 400 or 500 students within each group.
Right, two schools that were demographically very similar,
Yes.
but one had this and one was missing it.
Yes, with a larger sample as well.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you.
Fine. Yeah, I have a couple of questions also. Mikasa, I thought you did a very, very nice job. It's very thorough, very thoughtful. So just a couple of questions occurred to me while you were going through this. And your study couldn't tell you this, but just your sense of it after doing this study and examining it. What is your sense of long-term effects? Do you think that students who you found there was a relationship where there was some impact, perhaps some correlation between the RPI and more preferable behavior, whether it's positive or decreasing negative, either way? Do you have a sense that that's going to be a lasting effect, or would you suspect that over a period of time that those differences might fade away?
Good question. I appreciate it. I believe when we look at the dropout rates of young people, the percentages of young people who end up in unemployment, drop out of college, recidivism, the young people who get caught up in the criminal justice system. Some communities have a lot more resources, or at least resources to meet the population of students that they have. We know that sports are good for children, mentoring, a lot of the data, a lot of the previous studies showed that mentoring was important. That basically adult-youth interaction that is positive, productive, and substantive makes a difference. But we have large populations of young people who not only do not have those variables, but they have negative influences. They have negative role models. They have adults who are exposing them to drugs, and with the gangs, the adults exposing the young people to criminality. So I believe that the data, the outcomes are long-lasting and influential. It may be a drop-off or a decline at a certain age, but in those pivotal years where we find that young people end up in so much, the ones that do end up in so much trouble, regardless of community. This is a problem in some suburban and rural communities as well. Gangs are not just in inner city communities, but I think that it is long-lasting. I think that it is important. I think that we cannot ignore it. That we must have some interventions in place that address this. It's important. It's extremely important, and I think that RPIs and getting at the root of education is one of the ways that we can make a difference. I discussed in the study that we have a lot of social service programs, but the social service programs cannot meet the needs of such vast populations, whereas all young people come to schools, most of them, 99.9% of them, unless they drop out really early or something tragic like that happens. But most young people come to schools, so they are an audience that we're not reaching. It's good to learn about the rings of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter. That's fine, that's important. But meanwhile, those children go home to empty refrigerators and gangs outside their front doors with no way of understanding it, and they're attracted to it because those are the people that they look up to. So rites of passage provides them with an opportunity to understand the world around them. Even if they, let's say, a more fluent young person would have some certain types of coming-of-age challenges that someone in the North Philadelphia community would not, but they both would need some instruction on how to deal with the problems that they face. So I believe that it is long-lasting, yes, absolutely.
Well, that's a very thorough answer, and I think that your answer also suggests that we shouldn't look at RPI as a magic wand. It's not going to do the job by itself.
Correct.
But it does something good, that there's a good relationship here, and that in order to have lasting effects on people, it would also be good to see what about in high school, what kinds of interventions in high school are most helpful for maintaining positive behavior, decreasing negative behavior. Because it doesn't just suddenly start and stop or start. As you said, it's a continuum.
Yes.
So what combination of things? That would also be a very interesting study to see. You know, if you took your population of students who had significant RPI in their experience, then take them forward a few years into high school and see what kinds of interventions that might make a difference in continuing, you know, that kind of behavior. So that I think would be really valuable, and that's you can hint at that too. One concern I had though about your the two groups, the control group and the treatment group. When we're comparing the two, we have to make some assumptions that they're the same, that they come in essentially the same. In an experimental study, they should be identical except for your intervention, or whatever the intervention is. So the question is, were you concerned at all that maybe the two populations weren't the same? That were those, and I'm just asking the question, I don't know if this is the case, obviously, but were the students who were in the control group, why was it that they didn't have RPI? Were there other factors like family instability or insecurity, transiency, moving from school to school, poverty, whatever it may be? Were those factors different with them compared to your treatment group? And that if they were different, then how do we know that those factors weren't accounting for the differences?
Yes, appreciate the questions. First one, quickly. I found a study on mentoring that had a really low correlation in pro-social outcomes. And I found a separate study, another study, this is chapter 2, that combined mentoring with tutoring that had much higher outcomes. So it goes to what you're saying, that it's a combination of things that will make a difference. So with that, your other question, it was a large, which I didn't expect. It was a large group of 12th graders who transferred into the school. 12th graders at the school, they do not receive rites of passage. It goes from 9th to 11th. So I had a large population of 12th graders who did not have rites of passage. And unexpectedly, it was a lot of 9th graders who had rites of passage in the previous years because they had transferred from some other Philadelphia schools where they taught rites of passage. So that gave me some really good information to consider. But as well, which I highlighted in the study, there are hidden variables which are not measured always. For instance, I don't know that a child didn't come from a two-parent home, a stable two-parent home, and that as a result of that, and they might have had 1 year, 0 year, or 5 years of RPIs, but the hidden variable is really that they come from a strong family where mom and dad does everything that they can. It's an extended family. I didn't know if children had previous trauma. They might have had 2-3 years of RPIs, but because of the previous trauma, it could be physical, sexual, or family death, or any number of traumatic things that can happen to a young person, they could score more antisocial. They could be acting out behaviors. So yeah, I was concerned with that, and the populations were in the same school. But again, so the students that were in the control group, a lot of them were students that had transferred in. So, and that could be a hidden variable as well. So I was concerned about how that would influence the findings. But again, I did look at age grade and gender to try to at least mitigate some of the hidden variables.
And I think that's what most people do as well. So that's fine. Well, that's a hard question, and I'm glad to see that you've given that a lot of thought and consideration too. Thank you.
Okay. A couple of questions I had, Mikasa. You were saying that typically the students were getting the instruction once per week. In terms of, I'm curious, the curriculum, what were they getting that one time per week? What type of instruction, what were some of the topics perhaps that they were being exposed to and discussed with?
Sure. This is in chapter 3 on methodology. 45-minute block schedules for the courses, and like other courses, classes, holidays and breaks did interfere with the weekly instruction. The courses are designed around various topics. Some historical, where in fact in the class they were looking at the movie Roots, and this was in the male class, and the instructor was relating historic realities to current social problems, and the topic was around identity as well. Rites of passage is the one area where young people will discuss and talk about gangs, and will discuss and talk about drugs in open discussion, where some disagreement with the teacher would be welcome, because the teacher would want to, a good rites of passage teacher would want to challenge the long-held identities that you have. And as you know, once you get over 20 years old, you're old-fashioned to 9th or 10th grader. So a bridge is needed for the dialogue with the young people. They discuss current issues as well. Not only, current political issues, but current issues with youth. Who's the latest rapper? What's the message of that person? Do you think that it is negative or are you okay with it? I recall in my years of experience that a rites of passage teacher held a picture of this is in a female rights class, a picture of Michelle Obama. No, before that, a picture of a female rapper. And then ask the student, what do you think about this? Is this person good, bad, negative? What are your impressions? And then a picture of Michelle Obama. What do you think about this? So it allowed for a type of exchange to take place that you wouldn't normally get in another class.
In terms of the teachers that are doing the instruction, what type of professional development did they require? I mean, it seems like a lot of the impetus is on the teacher, in terms of facilitating the discussion, making the students feel comfortable, that their ideas are respected, and so I'm just curious, what kind of training do they have before they go into the class and say, okay, you'll be teaching, rites of instruction, rites of passage of instruction, in September?
Yeah, good question. It is, in my experience and from the study, it's something that's extremely needed. And the few schools who have rites of passage, and there's only a handful of them in Philadelphia, discuss the CB schools, the Council of Independent Black Institutions. Those schools, most of them have rites of passage. And even if it's not labeled rites of passage, they have it in other components. Whereas most of the schools do not. Public schools do not have rites of passage. You'll find it in some charter schools because of the legislative mandate of charters is to be different, to be unique. But most charters don't have rites of passage. So the teachers are often, and I'm saying this from experience as well, are often left with a need for increased professional development. It is definitely a need for that. And my argument is that it would make a difference. It's looked at, in a lot of the schools that have it, is looked at as something, it's important, but it's kind of off to the side. It's not the core curriculum. If a substitute teacher is needed, we'll cancel rights for this day, and that maybe we can use the rights teacher. It's looked at as, the other subject.
And you're also competing with standardized testing,
Yes.
trying to fit it into an already very crowded curriculum, which is, everyone's looking, to the spring for the PSSA or the Keystone exams, which is, again, where do you fit this in?
Right, which is why part of the implications of my research is that rights is attached to instructional outcomes, which is very easy to do, but it'll come with the professional development as well. If it's attached to writing outcomes, essays, can students do a 5-point essay? If it's attached to presentations and projects and learning outcomes, that it can meet the needs of the standardized test as well as the very important cost-benefit ratio that's needed by youth.
Also, from your research, you mentioned like from 9th to 11th grade, from your study. Do you see it at the middle school level as well?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, dating trajectories with middle and high school students found that children as young, when they start dating 4th, 5th, 6th grade, that they have trajectories for negative behavior into their senior year, and I would say beyond. So I believe that it is extremely important for K-12 education. It would look different, for instance, kindergarten, first, second grader, their rites of passage may be about how to get along with friends. You wouldn't, of course, discuss the heavier societal issues with second graders, but they could discuss, how do you treat Johnny? How, if you and Kim are having conflict, what's the right conflict resolution for that? So it's different things that they can do in the rites of passage with young people, and they could write sentences, just like they do in language arts. But as well, definitely middle school. We know those are those transition years, and absolutely high school, where young people become exposed to tremendous amounts and frequencies of antisocial behaviors. But one of the studies was on a Middle Eastern university, where there were Middle Eastern students, some Caribbean students, some European students. It was rites of passage. They reflected on their coming of age years in previous years, so it could possibly as well fit into a university setting as well.
I also thought it was interesting when in your dissertation, you mentioned it today, that most of our major religions have some ceremony or preparation for rites of passage, which, I can understand and see that, but then you make the point, however, less of our youngsters are, kind of moving towards organized religion or seeking membership in some of our religious groups, so that kind of cancels out some of that positive impact of the religious aspect of it as well. My final question is, where do you go from here? You seem very passionate about the topic and very well trained. I mean, you teach it yourself.
Yes, from here I want to find the districts in the country, beginning with Pennsylvania, who would be interested in rites of passage, who would be interested in not only the study but implementing programs. The schools that already have it, what are some things that you could do to make your program stronger? Maybe you don't have learning outcomes attached to it. Maybe it's once a week. Maybe you have the ceremonies without the instructions. So I want to find the schools that have it and give them some of the findings, offer my expertise for consultation if needed. I don't see a limit. I don't see a ceiling to what I want to do.
Right. And maybe giving the youngsters another alternative to think about in terms of, the gang membership and the other antisocial behaviors that you mentioned this afternoon.
Correct. Yes, sir.
Also, I commend you on, the job that you did over the past 3 years. I know how much work you put into it.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions from our committee members at this time?
No?
Okay, at this time I would ask our committee, our dissertation committee, to poll about moving forward with the dissertation and oral defense. Dr. Kiris?
Yes, I'm in full support.
Okay, Dr. Banlow?
Yes, I'm thinking back, it was a little more than 3 years ago when I met Mikasa and first had the opportunity to talk about this program with him. And I've enjoyed our relationship and getting to know him better and talking with him and going through some rough spots from time to time and then some really good spots too. And all the way from that to our time in Ireland and with the learning opportunities we had there. So I am very, very pleased to offer my yes vote as well and affirm this approval of this dissertation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Banlow. I'm also in agreement, to pass you and approve your dissertation and oral defense this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Kiris?
Yes.
I'm going to have Dr. Banlow and myself sign off on the applicable forms now, the graduation requirements net form and the approval form as well. Now, Kelly Doyle will send the two forms to you electronically for your signature so that you can sign them
Oh, wonderful.
and send it back to us electronically.
That's wonderful.
Okay, so I'll sign first.
Dr. Matt, congratulations.
Thank you.
Doctor.
Come everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, party, we're done with this part, folks.
All right, I'm going to sign off. Thank you
All right,
so much.
Kate.
Congratulations.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kate, for this answer.
Second.
So first, you and your committee, if that's okay, and then you and the
Sure.
thing.